It began with a sound that no one in the small Pennsylvania Valley had ever heard before. A deep, shuddering roar that seemed to rise from the earth itself, like a mountain clearing its throat before swallowing a town whole. On May 31st, 1889, the people of Johnstown were finishing their workday under heavy gray skies. The rain had been falling for days, but in a region built on steel and stubbornness, rain was just another inconvenience. Rivers rose and fell all the time. Flooding was expected. It was survivable. What was not survivable was what was coming. 14 miles upstream, perched high above the Conemaugh Valley, sat the South Fork Dam. Behind it rested Lake Conemaugh, an artificial reservoir owned by wealthy industrialists from Pittsburgh. The lake was a private retreat, a playground for America's elite during the Gilded Age, men who built railroads, forged steel empires, and reshaped the nation's economy. But the dam holding back that lake had been poorly maintained. Originally constructed in the 50s as part of a canal system, the dam had changed hands multiple times. By the 1880s, it belonged to a private club of millionaires. The dam had been modified, lowered in places to accommodate a carriage road, spillways inadequately maintained, debris allowed to clog drainage systems. Engineers had expressed concerns. Repairs were incomplete. Warnings were ignored, because nothing had gone wrong yet. By late May 1889, relentless rainfall had swollen the lake to dangerous levels. Water pressed against the earthen dam with increasing force. Club members were absent. Local workers scrambled to clear spillways, digging frantically as rain pounded their backs. Telegraph messages were sent downstream to warn Johnstown the dam might fail. But earlier warnings had proven false. Residents had heard this before. They stayed. At approximately 3:10 p.m., the South Fork Dam gave way. In less than an hour, 20 million tons of water, nearly 5 billion gallons, thundered down the valley, its speeds estimated at 40 miles per hour. It was not merely water. It carried with it trees ripped from hillsides, railroad cars, livestock, houses torn from foundations, telegraph poles, entire barns. The wave grew as it traveled, consuming everything in its path. Witnesses upstream described a wall of water 40 feet high. In Johnstown, some heard the roar seconds before impact. Others saw it, a dark, churning mass filling the valley from hillside to hillside. Then it struck. Buildings splintered instantly, steel rail lines twisted like wire. Entire city blocks were lifted and shoved forward in a grinding avalanche of destruction. People clung to rooftops, only to have those rooftops torn apart. Families were separated in seconds. Horses screamed, steam engines toppled, bridges snapped. Within 10 minutes, Johnstown was unrecognizable. But the horror did not end with the impact. As the torrent surged through the city, debris accumulated against the massive Pennsylvania Railroad stone bridge. Thousands of tons of wreckage jammed against its arches, forming a temporary dam of its own. Homes, timber, oil-soaked materials, and human beings became entangled in the growing pile. Then, fire broke out. Oil from overturned locomotives ignited. Flames spread across the debris field, trapping survivors who had survived the water, only to face burning wreckage. The inferno lasted through the night. Some who had clung to survival in the pile perished in the flames. When the water finally receded, more than 2,200 people were dead. It remains one of the deadliest disasters in American history. Entire families vanished. Bodies were found miles downstream, some never identified. Makeshift morgues were established. Coffins ran out. It
When the
began
waters
with a sound
receded
that
from
no one in
Johnstown,
the small
grief
Pennsylvania
quickly
Valley
turned
had
into
ever
something
heard
sharper.
before.
Suspicion.
A deep, shuddering
The scale
roar
of the
that seemed to
destruction was
rise
too
from
vast,
the earth
too
itself,
concentrated,
like a mountain
too
clearing its throat
catastrophic to be
before
dismissed
swallowing
as
a
mere
town
weather.
whole.
Survivors
On May
knew it.
31st,
Engineers
1889,
quietly admitted it. Journalists began investigating it, and attorneys prepared for what many believed would be one of the most consequential legal battles in American history. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was not an ordinary organization. Its membership list read like a directory of Gilded Age power. Among its most prominent members was steel titan Andrew Carnegie, one of the wealthiest men in the world. Other members included executives, financiers, and industrial magnates who shaped America's railroads, steel mills, and banking networks. Most of them were not present when the dam failed. Many were vacationing elsewhere. But absence did not erase ownership. Public outrage grew as newspapers across the country published detailed accounts of the dam's history. Originally built as part of Pennsylvania's canal system in the 1850s, it had been sold to private investors after falling into disuse. When the club purchased the property in 1879, they transformed the reservoir into a private lake resort. In doing so, they made modifications. The dam was lowered in places to allow a carriage road across its crest. The original discharge pipes, designed to release excess water, were removed and never properly replaced. Fish screens installed to improve recreation sometimes trapped debris, reducing spillway efficiency. Maintenance records were inconsistent. Repair recommendations were incomplete. These details became central to the legal storm that followed. More than 1,600 lawsuits were filed against the club and its members. Survivors demanded compensation for lost homes, lost businesses, and lost family members. They believed the case was straightforward. Negligence had caused the dam to fail. But the American legal system in 1889 was not structured as it is today. At the time, tort law heavily favored property owners and industrial interests. The prevailing doctrine often required proof of direct negligence, not merely ownership of a defective structure. Defense attorneys argued that the flood was an unavoidable natural disaster caused by unprecedented rainfall. They framed it as an act of God. This phrase carried enormous legal weight. If an event could be classified as an unavoidable act of nature, liability could evaporate. Responsibility dissolved into fate. Court proceedings dragged on. Plaintiffs struggled to prove specific negligent actions that directly caused the breach. Engineering evidence was debated. Witness testimonies conflicted. The club's legal team was formidable, experienced, and well-funded. In the end, not a single member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was held financially liable. Not one. For many Americans, this outcome felt like a confirmation of what critics had already suspected about the Gilded Age, that wealth conferred protection not only from poverty but from accountability. Newspapers reflected divided opinions. Some editorials defended the verdict, arguing that nature's fury could not be fully controlled. Others condemned it as a miscarriage of justice. Behind the scenes, however, the Johnstown Flood quietly influenced legal thinking. The case exposed weaknesses in negligence law. It highlighted the difficulty of holding powerful corporations and wealthy individuals accountable for infrastructure failures. It prompted legal scholars to reconsider standards of liability, especially in cases involving inherently dangerous structures like dams. Over time, American jurisprudence began to shift. By the early 20th century, courts increasingly embraced stricter standards for hazardous activities. The concept of strict liability gained traction in certain contexts, meaning that responsibility could exist regardless of intent or direct negligence if someone maintained a dangerous condition that caused harm.
Long before the rain began falling in May of 1889, the fate of Johnstown had already been quietly shaped by engineering decisions made decades earlier. To understand how the South Fork Dam failed, you must first understand how it was built. The dam was originally constructed between 1847 and 1853 by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as part of the Pennsylvania Main Line Canal System, a vast transportation network designed to compete with New York's Erie Canal. At the time, canals were critical infrastructure. Railroads had not yet fully dominated long-distance freight transport. The dam was built of earth and rock, an earthen embankment dam, approximately 72 feet high and over 900 feet long. At its core was compacted clay meant to act as a watertight barrier. On its downstream face, stone riprap provided reinforcement. 5 large cast-iron discharge pipes ran through the base, allowing controlled release of water. When properly maintained, such a structure could be stable, but earthen dams have vulnerabilities. They depend on compaction integrity. They require functioning spillways. They cannot tolerate overtopping when water flows over the top of the dam, because flowing water erodes soil rapidly. The Pennsylvania Canal System eventually declined as railroads became dominant. By the 1860s, the dam fell into private ownership. Maintenance declined. A partial breach occurred in 1862, though it did not destroy Johnstown. Repairs were performed, but documentation was incomplete. Then, in 1879, the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club purchased the property. What followed were modifications that, while seemingly minor at the time, proved catastrophic under extreme stress. First, the crest of the dam was lowered. To create a carriage road across the top, the elevation was reduced by several feet compared to the original design. That meant the margin between lake level and overtopping was smaller. Second, the original discharge pipes were reportedly removed or became inoperable. Some historical accounts suggest the pipes were sold for scrap. Others indicate they had already deteriorated. Regardless, by 1889, there was no effective low-level outlet to draw down the lake quickly in an emergency. Third, fish screens were installed across the spillway to prevent prized fish from escaping. These screens, under normal conditions, seemed harmless. Under flood conditions, they could trap floating debris. Each change by itself did not guarantee failure. Together, they reduced resilience. By late May 1889, an intense weather system stalled over western Pennsylvania. Over several days, more than 6 inches of rain fell in parts of the region. Tributaries swelled. Soil became saturated. Runoff accelerated into Lake Conemaugh. By the morning of May 31st, the lake level was alarmingly high. Club workers attempted emergency measures. They shoveled earth to raise the crest. They tried to clear debris from the spillway. They worked in pounding rain as water crept upward. Engineering analysis after the disaster suggests that the spillway capacity was insufficient for the inflow volume. Modern hydrological modeling indicates that while the rainfall was heavy, a properly maintained dam with adequate spillway capacity might have survived. The critical moments likely came when water began to overtop the lowered crest. Earthen dams cannot withstand sustained overtopping. Once water begins flowing over the top, it erodes soil rapidly. Small channels deepen into gullies. As erosion accelerates, flow increases. Structural integrity collapses quickly. Witnesses near the dam reported seeing water pouring over its surface before failure. Around 3:10 p.m., a breach opened. Within minutes, it widened dramatically. The entire central section gave way. Approximately 20 million tons of water were released in less than an hour. The flood wave did not travel as a simple wall. It behaved more like a rapidly moving surge front filled with entrained debris. As it moved downstream, it scoured.
The statistics are staggering. More than 2,200 dead, thousands injured, 4 square miles of destruction. But numbers do not scream. Numbers do not cling to rooftops. Numbers do not search for children in muddy silence. To understand the Johnstown flood, you must leave engineering reports behind and step into the lives of the people who stood in its path.
In the late afternoon of May 31st, 1889, 23-year-old Gertrude Slattery was in her home when she heard what she later described as a rumbling like distant thunder. Within seconds, the sound intensified into something unrecognizable, not thunder, not wind, not train, but something alive. She ran to the door. What she saw was not water as she knew it. It was black, boiling, filled with splintered wood and entire buildings riding its surface. The waves swallowed the street before she could fully comprehend it. Her home collapsed almost instantly. Gertrude was thrown into the torrent and somehow managed to grab hold of floating debris. She clung to it as the flood carried her through streets she no longer recognized. Around her, people screamed, prayed, vanished. She would later testify that the noise was so overwhelming that individual voices blurred into one continuous cry. She survived. Many did not. One of the most haunting survivor accounts comes from 6-year-old Daniel Smith, who was separated from his family when their home disintegrated. Daniel found himself clinging to a mattress carried by the current. For hours, he drifted among wreckage until rescuers found him miles downstream. His parents were never located. Entire families disappeared from census records in a single afternoon. The Cambria Iron Works, one of Johnstown's largest employers, was devastated. Steel workers who had survived molten furnaces and industrial hazards were no match for a river-turned weapon. Many died still wearing their work clothes. At the Pennsylvania Railroad's Stone Bridge, the flood's deadliest aftermath unfolded. As debris piled against the bridge's arches, survivors found temporary refuge atop tangled wreckage. They believed they had escaped the water's fury. Then, flames appeared. Oil from derailed locomotives ignited. Fire spread across the floating mass of wood and homes. Trapped survivors could not escape. The water still raged beneath them, and the debris formed walls around them. Some chose to jump back into the flood rather than burn. The fire at the bridge burned for 3 days. When rescuers finally dismantled the debris pile, they found hundreds of bodies fused into the wreckage. Among the victims was a baby, later known as the unknown child. For months, no one could identify her. Donations were raised for a proper burial. Her story captivated the nation, a symbol of innocence lost in industrial America's most shocking catastrophe. Eventually, the child was identified as 18-month-old Mary Cecilia Quinn. Even decades later, residents spoke of her name in hushed tones. In the immediate aftermath, Johnstown resembled a battlefield. Mud coated everything, horses lay where they had fallen, railroad tracks twisted into impossible shapes. Safes were found blocks from their original locations. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to bare foundations. Rescue efforts were chaotic at first. Survivors clawed through debris searching for loved ones. The stench of death grew unbearable as days passed. That is when a remarkable figure arrived, Clara Barton. At 67 years old, Barton led the American Red Cross into one of its earliest and most defining missions. She established large-scale relief operations, organized supply distribution, and coordinated temporary housing construction.
In the months after the floodwaters receded from Johnstown, something less visible began to rise across the United States. Doubt. Doubt about unchecked industrial power. Doubt about private control over public safety. Doubt about whether wealth had grown faster than responsibility. The Johnstown flood did not immediately overturn American law. It did not send magnates to prison. It did not bankrupt the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. But it planted a seed. To understand its long-term impact, you must look at America in 1889. This was the height of the Gilded Age, a term popularized by Mark Twain to describe a society glittering with wealth on the surface, but corroded underneath. Industrial giants dominated the economy. Among them was Andrew Carnegie, whose steel empire symbolized American progress. Railroads stretched coast to coast, cities exploded in population, immigration fueled factories, fortunes multiplied. But regulation lagged far behind expansion. Infrastructure such as dams, rail lines, and factories were often owned privately with minimal oversight. There were few federal safety standards. Inspection systems were inconsistent. Tort law required victims to prove specific negligence, an enormous challenge when facing wealthy defendants with elite legal teams. The Johnstown lawsuits failed, yet their failure became a powerful example cited in legal discussions for decades. At the time, courts largely followed the principle that liability required proof of fault. If defendants could argue that an event was an act of God, responsibility evaporated. That doctrine shielded powerful interests from accountability in many industrial accidents. However, public dissatisfaction with such outcomes grew. The 1990s and early 1900s saw a surge in reformist thinking. The progressive era began to take shape. Activists, journalists, and policymakers pushed for structural changes to address corporate excess and public vulnerability. The Johnstown Flood became part of that broader narrative, a case study in the dangers of inadequate oversight. One legal concept that gradually gained traction was strict liability for inherently dangerous activities. Under strict liability, responsibility can exist regardless of intent or negligence. If you maintain something dangerous and it causes harm, you may be liable simply because of the risk involved. Although Johnstown itself did not establish this doctrine, it influenced conversations around it. In 1868, a British case called Rylands versus Fletcher had established strict liability for dangerous reservoirs. American courts initially hesitated to adopt similar standards broadly, but over time, especially in cases involving explosives, hazardous materials, and dam failures, stricter interpretations began appearing. The shift was gradual, but it was real. Meanwhile, the flood also strengthened the argument for government oversight of infrastructure. By the early 20th century, states increasingly implemented dam inspection programs. Engineering standards improved. Civil engineering emerged as a more formalized profession, with ethical codes emphasizing public safety. Universities expanded engineering education. Professional organizations such as the American Civil Engineers grew in influence, promoting best practices in hydrology and structural design. The disaster also contributed to the broader cultural shift that questioned whether laissez-faire capitalism adequately. The Johnstown Flood was not the last time America would stand in the wreckage of its own ambition. It was only the beginning. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the United States accelerated into modernity. Skyscrapers pierced city skylines. Factories operated around the clock. Bridges spanned vast rivers. Dams multiplied across the West. Industry became the heartbeat of the nation. But with every leap forward came risk. And time after time, tragedy asked the same question Johnstown had first shouted into the national consciousness. When progress turns deadly, who is responsible? The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, 1911. On March 25, 1911, a fire broke out on the 8th floor of a garment factory in New York City. Within minutes, flames spread through fabric scraps and wooden tables. The factory was owned by Max Blank and Isaac Harris. The upper floors had limited exits. Some doors were locked, allegedly to prevent theft or unauthorized breaks. As smoke filled the rooms, workers, mostly young immigrant women, rushed to escape. The fire escape collapsed, elevators failed, windows became the only option. Witnesses on the street watched in horror as workers jumped to their deaths. By the time the flames were extinguished, 146 people were dead. Like Johnstown, the Triangle disaster exposed the lethal consequences of neglected safety in pursuit of efficiency and profit. Public outrage was immense. Unlike the aftermath of the South Fork Dam lawsuits, however, the political response was swifter. New York enacted sweeping workplace safety reforms. Fire codes were strengthened, labor regulations expanded, inspections increased. The lesson that Johnstown had introduced, that private negligence could produce public catastrophe, resurfaced with urgency. The St. Francis Dam collapse, 1928. Nearly 4 decades after Johnstown, another dam failure devastated a community, this time in California. The St. Francis Dam, designed by engineer William Mulholland, was completed in 1926 to supply water to Los Angeles. In the early hours of March 12, 1928, it collapsed without warning. A massive wall of water surged down San Francisco Canyon, killing more than 400 people. Engineering investigations revealed structural weaknesses in the dam's foundation and design. Mulholland publicly accepted responsibility, stating, "If there was an error of human judgment, I was the human." Unlike the South Fork Dam case, the St. Francis disaster occurred in a period when engineering oversight had grown more formalized. Investigations were systematic, accountability debates were more transparent. Yet the core reality remained the same. A man-made structure failed, and lives were lost. Johnstown's shadow was unmistakable.
Long after the debris is cleared, long after the funerals end, long after the headlines fade, something invisible remains: memory. Not just individual memory, but collective memory. The Johnstown Flood of 1889 did more than destroy a town. It carved itself into the American mind. And what makes it extraordinary is not only the scale of loss, but how it shaped the way Americans process catastrophe itself. Because disaster is never only physical, it is psychological. The first shock, when the world stops making sense. In the immediate aftermath of Johnstown, survivors described a strange numbness. Many reported moving through wreckage without fully understanding what had happened. Some searched for loved ones for hours before realizing entire neighborhoods had vanished. Modern psychologists call this acute stress response, the brain's survival mode. But in 1889, there was no vocabulary for trauma. There was no concept of PTSD. There were no counselors waiting in shelters. There was only shock. People replayed the moment of impact in their minds repeatedly. The sound, the water, the collapse. Trauma embeds itself in sensory memory. Survivors decades later could still describe the exact tone of the roar as the dam failed. The body remembers what the calendar tries to move past. The need for meaning. Disasters shatter assumptions. Before May 31, 1889, many residents of Johnstown believed flooding was manageable. They had survived previous high waters. After the flood, that assumption died. When disaster strikes, people search for explanation. In 1889, explanations divided into 3 categories: divine will, natural inevitability, human negligence. The act of God legal defense clashed directly with survivor belief that human decisions had contributed to the tragedy. That tension between fate and responsibility is central to disaster psychology. If something is purely natural, it is terrifying but impersonal. If something is preventable, it is infuriating. Johnstown became a psychological battleground between those narratives. Collective grief and public ritual.
One of the most powerful psychological responses to disaster is ritual. Funerals in Johnstown were not isolated family events, they became communal acts of mourning. Entire neighborhoods attended burials. The unknown plot at Grandview Cemetery became sacred ground. Shared mourning transforms trauma into collective identity. Johnstown was no longer just a town, it became the town that survived the flood. This transformation happens repeatedly in American history. Communities defined by tragedy often adopt it as part of their identity, not to glorify loss, but to anchor resilience. Memorialization and control. When people cannot control the past, they create symbols. In 1964, the site of the failed dam was preserved as the Johnstown Flood National Memorial. Visitors walk quiet earth where catastrophe once erupted. Memorials serve psychological purposes. They acknowledge suffering. They validate memory. They create a structured place for grief. They prevent erasure. Without memorials, trauma feels dismissed. With them, it becomes recognized history. The same pattern appears at sites like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Building, where plaques mark the fire that changed labor law, and at the Oklahoma City National Memorial, where empty chairs represent lives lost in 1995. Physical space becomes emotional architecture. Survivor's guilt. One recurring psychological effect in disaster survivors is survivor's guilt, the persistent question, why did I live when others did not? Accounts from Johnstown include individuals who lost entire families yet survived by chance, grabbing the right piece of debris. More than a century has passed since the South Fork Dam collapsed above Johnstown. The world has changed dramatically. America now has satellites monitoring storms, advanced engineering models predicting floods, and massive federal agencies responsible for disaster response. Computers simulate dam stability. Radar tracks rainfall in real time. Yet the questions raised in 1889 have not disappeared. In many ways, they have become even more urgent. Because the infrastructure built during America's great industrial expansion is now aging, and the climate producing extreme weather is changing. America's vast infrastructure network. Today, the United States operates one of the largest infrastructure systems on Earth. There are more than 90,000 dams across the country. Many were built during the early and mid-20th century to generate power, control floods, and supply drinking water. Thousands are classified as high hazard potential, meaning their failure could cause loss of life downstream. Responsibility for dam oversight varies between federal and state authorities, including organizations such as the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and regulatory programs within individual states. Many dams are safe, but a significant portion were constructed decades ago, using standards that have since evolved. The average age of U.S. dams now exceeds 50 years. That means many structures are approaching or exceeding the lifespan originally envisioned by their designers. Maintenance is expensive. Upgrades require political will and funding, and sometimes warnings go unnoticed, just as they did in 1889. Extreme weather in a changing climate. Another factor reshaping risk is climate. Scientific research within the field of climate science shows that warmer global temperatures influence precipitation patterns. In many regions, heavy rainfall events are becoming more intense. For dams, levees, and stormwater systems, rainfall intensity matters more than averages. A structure designed for a 19th century rainfall pattern may face very different conditions in the 21st century. The danger is not only dam failure. Urban flooding, levee overtopping, and storm surge all test infrastructure limits. The Near Disaster at Oroville Dam, 2017. In February 2017, heavy rain in California filled Lake Oroville, the state's second-largest reservoir. Water began pouring down the dam's concrete spillway. Suddenly, a massive crater opened in the structure, revealing severe damage. Engineers feared that continued erosion could threaten the emergency spillway and potentially trigger uncontrolled flooding. Authorities ordered the evacuation of nearly 200,000 people. For a moment, the United States faced the possibility of a disaster echoing Johnstown. Fortunately, emergency repairs and reduced inflow prevented catastrophic failure. But the incident revealed how quickly infrastructure crises can develop. Investigations later found maintenance and design concerns that had gone unaddressed. The lesson was unmistakable. Even modern systems can approach failure unexpectedly. Hurricane Katrina, 2005. Another defining American infrastructure disaster occurred in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast. Storm surge and levee failures flooded large portions of New Orleans. More than 1,800 people died.
Some become statistics in textbooks. Some fade into regional memory. And some, like the Johnstown Flood, become permanent warnings carved into a nation's story. By the time the cleanup in Johnstown ended in late 1889, the town had buried more than 2,200 people. Nearly 10 square kilometers of land had been destroyed. Thousands were homeless. Millions of dollars in property had vanished in less than an hour. But the physical destruction was only part of the story. The flood had exposed a deeper truth about industrial America. For much of the 19th century, the United States believed strongly in unlimited progress. Railroads connected oceans, steel built cities, factories produced wealth on an unprecedented scale. The country was becoming an industrial giant. Yet Johnstown revealed something that progress often tries to ignore. Every system has limits. The South Fork Dam had once represented innovation and ambition. When it was first built decades earlier, it symbolized transportation advancement and economic opportunity. Later, it became a private retreat for wealthy businessmen who believed the lake above Johnstown was harmless. But infrastructure does not care about reputation, wealth, or optimism. It obeys physics. Water pressure increases, earth erodes, structures weaken. When maintenance and design fail, nature simply follows the path of least resistance. And on May 31, 1889, that path ran directly through the homes, streets, and lives of Johnstown. The town that refused to disappear. Despite the devastation, the people of Johnstown did something remarkable. They stayed. Within months, businesses reopened, rail lines were repaired, steel production resumed, new homes appeared where old neighborhoods had vanished. The valley filled again with the sounds of industry. To outsiders, this might seem surprising. Why rebuild in a place that had just experienced one of the worst disasters in American history? The answer lies in something deeper than economics: community. Families had roots in the valley. Workers depended on the steel mills. Churches, schools, and neighborhoods formed the structure of everyday life. Leaving would have meant abandoning not only buildings, but identity. So the people of Johnstown rebuilt, carrying the memory of the flood with them. The legacy of reform. Although the lawsuits against the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club failed, the disaster quietly influenced American law and engineering. Over time, courts became more willing to hold corporations responsible for dangerous infrastructure. Safety standards expanded. Professional engineering oversight strengthened. Organizations like the American Civil Engineers Association promoted stricter design practices. Emergency response systems evolved. The long relief